Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, Prime Minister Modi of India has met a number of leaders from Kashmir. This is, of course, after Article 370 was revoked, revoking then the autonomous status of that region as well. As understood by India. And of course, there was a lot of criticism of those Kashmir leaders who did decide to agree to meet Prime Minister Modi. Seemingly his demand was that they then sign up to agreeing to the revocation of Article 370, which did not occur. Nevertheless, what does this say, A, about his aims to try to normalize what has happened there in occupied Kashmir? A, and B, then about his failure then to be able to do so, or to be able to convince these leaders to then sign on to what he wanted them to say and state. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Zaffar, who is the chairman of the Kashmir Campaign Global. He is joining us now from London. Zaffar, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today. Let's start from right at the top, right? So just when the meeting itself was announced, that in and of itself created a lot of controversy about the fact that these people would even agree to meet Modi. What are your thoughts about that?
First of all, thank you, Waqar Saab and the Indus News for being the voice of the people of Kashmir on the international media. Indeed, I think, this whole meeting has been nothing but a political marketing exercise, both for the Modi in order to try to assure the people within India, but most importantly, just to give a narrative out to the world that we're trying to bring normalcy into the Kashmir. So, as you rightly said, from the really get-go, it has been a fiasco. It has been a controversial. There was no commitment from the central government, officially communication to the so-called leaders. That's one thing I wanted to highlight. You mentioned that they were the leaders of Kashmir. Let's be clear. The Gupkar lapdog alliance, as I like to call them, are not the representatives or the leaders of the Kashmiri people. The true representatives have been imprisoned either in the jails across India or in their own homes. So firstly, the people who were called in for a meeting weren't the representatives or the leaders of the people of Kashmir. They were the lapdogs, the linchpins of the Indian government who have been there implementing the Indian agenda for their own benefit.
There's, of course, the issue of this was a 3-hour-long meeting, right? So it was quite a long meeting in context. And I would think that Modi failed, didn't he? Because they didn't really sign on to accepting the revocation of Article 370.
Oh, absolutely. I think, one thing that became clear from this meeting itself regarding this fascist government is that all this narrative and all this drum beating that they have been doing for the last 2 years, that they have won the people of Kashmir and the people are in agreement with them, is clearly what we heard after the meeting is it was an indirect admission of a failure on the part of the government itself. And, it was a clear message to the world that the people of Kashmir have rejected this allegation that it's a normalcy in Kashmir and people of Kashmir wanted this Article 370, including the Indian linchpins, the so-called puppeteers who were invited to this meeting, have outrightly rejected the abrogation of Article 370. But at the same time, we need to kind of understand that this meeting was not about 370 or taking or listening to the voices of these linchpins. It was more of a marketing exercise, and it was a sort of a script out from a blue book to tell to the people of, to these linchpins that, look, we are going ahead with, what their agenda is in order to change the demography, whether that is through delimitation or not. So I think, yes, on one side, it was there was a clarity that India has failed to do anything in Kashmir. They have failed to curb the voices, the aspirations of the people of Kashmir. And as a people of Kashmir, whether, no matter which ideology you belong to, we stand still firm in our demand for the right of self-determination.
I wonder, though, do you think it will give pause to the Modi government at all, or will it, in fact, give them more resolve to go ahead with what they want to do vis-a-vis occupied Kashmir? Because even if, as you describe these people as not being leaders, but as basically just being, lapdogs, if even your own lapdogs are telling you, listen, revocation of Article 370 was not a good idea, we cannot sign on to it, even if they're the ones saying this to you, then I would think that that should give you pause and should possibly make you reconsider your next moves?
To be honest, I personally think that that may not be the case. See, these lapdogs are there just to be the puppeteers. I think, this pretty much to me looks like a scene out of the Blue Book, which has already been scripted through. The fascist government is hell-bent on changing the demography of the Kashmiri people, especially targeting the Muslims in Kashmir. We've already seen these things are already happening in place. The laws haven't changed. The domicile certificate laws haven't implemented in the Kashmir. The land laws haven't changed in order to facilitate that under the legal regimes. Any voices that stand for the truth, freedom, justice in Kashmir or across the India as well have been curbed. The media is getting filtered through. We sincerely, truly believe that this government, every Indian government, but especially this fascist government, is truly bent on changing the demography of Kashmir, targeting the Muslims of Kashmir itself. So I don't think they were there to listen to their lapdogs, but it was more of a marketing exercise, a public stunt to show to the international world that, look, we are listening. But, we've seen reality. There was no commitment made by the Modi government to these linchpins to say, yeah, we have listened to you. We will start thinking about it. There was no true representation from the Indian occupied Kashmir. All the APIC leaders have been imprisoned. So I don't think this meeting was about listening to the views of these lapdogs. It was more like, yes, we brought you in. It was a great photo ops. So we've done the Photoshop, but here's our next move, that we will go with the delimitation, and then we will think about elections. So, that was pretty clear that these, their own lapdogs don't actually hold any value. So truly, I think this was a humiliation for these lapdogs even to be there.
Zaffar, we're quickly running out of time, so we have about a minute and a half left. I want to get your final thoughts before I let you go. On the issue then of what happens next, do you think, in occupied Kashmir? Because obviously the Kashmir people will not take all of this lying down, right? I mean, demographic changes, as there have already been attempts to change the demography ever so slowly, or maybe now that will be sped up. I mean, what are your thoughts about what happens next and the kind of resistance that we may see?
I think people have really had it up to their necks in the in occupied Kashmir, even with the presence of over 1 million armed forces. They have vented out their frustrations. They have highlighted the anger and the humiliation that they have felt. They are, we're highlighting it everywhere through social media. What India is doing within Kashmir. I truly believe that the people of Kashmir are not going to give up. I was speaking to the people on the ground just yesterday, and there is not even a slightest hint that the people of Kashmir will give up the struggle for right of self-determination. Yes, we know that the India is going to utilize more and more of these tactics, but no matter what, we will continue to stand for our freedom struggle. That's the right of self-determination with whatever means we have. But I think this is a question for the international community now, where they really need to stand, wake up and realize that, look, up till now, what they've been hearing from this fascist Modi government, that there's a normalcy in Kashmir, now through their own admonitions, they are saying that Kashmiris are far away from New Delhi and from their hearts. So everything they've been saying till now has been false. The international community now really needs to do something before things in Kashmir get out of control.
Very well, we'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us today here in Scope. That was Zaffar Quraishi speaking to us today from London. We were discussing there that meeting that is taking place between Prime Minister Modi as well as, I termed them, of course, Kashmiri leaders, but as Zaffar there said, they're pretty much lapdogs of the Indian government itself, but they are, quote unquote, leaders of occupied Kashmir. even though, as we know, many Kashmiris were unhappy with the fact that they even agreed to meet Modi to begin with. And then, yes, they did disagree and reject signing on to any letter or statement that said that they agreed with the revocation of Article 370. But as Zaffar there contextualized for us, this was not really about necessarily the revocation of Article 370. It was more of a PR move, and or just an FYI on the part of the Modi government that demographic changes, as he wants to see occur, will continue going ahead. Nevertheless, the Kashmiri people, though, will resist that in fashions that we will possibly see in the coming days as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, there's an incident that's occurred in the Black Sea between the UK and Russia. Now, the accusations back and forth are obviously polar opposites, but it really then comes down to the understanding of Crimea and what Russia's territorial water limits then actually are, considering the entire issue of Crimea as well. The UK says it did not enter Russian territorial waters. The Russians say that the UK did, that warship of the UK did enter Russian waters, and then it did fire warning shots towards that defender vessel. The UK is saying that it does not recognize, obviously, the annexation of Crimea, according to that government. So this is, again, the latest example of continuing tensions between European countries as well as Russia. And one wonders, after today's decision of the EU as well to not then decide to meet President Putin, if this is a continuation and if this will then be the path that will continue to go down, even with closer countries such as the Europeans as well as Russia. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Anastasia Likhacheva, who is the director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at HSE. She's joining us today from Moscow. Joining us today from Perm is Dr. Pavel Luzin, who is a contributor at Jamestown Foundation and Riddle. Pavel and Anastasia, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Pavel, let me start with you first. Who do you believe really in this incident on the Black Sea? Do you think the UK testing almost Russia?
In my opinion, this accident was mostly rhetorical accident than real accident. Because Russian military are not stupid, they are clever enough not to shot against British vessel. And according to the British reaction, I think in case of real shooting, the British reaction would be different. But nevertheless, Russia tried to demonstrate that it pretends on being a dominating power in the Black Sea region. It wants to demonstrate that Russia is ready to act actively and aggressively against any adversary or any forces that Russia will consider adversary, like it was in 2018 when the Russian Navy attacked Ukrainian vessels in Kerch Strait.
Anastasia, do you agree with that? Is this Russia trying to flex its muscles and show who is the real power in the Black Sea?
Well, I would say that I don't think that it's the finite purpose in any case. This incident could take place almost any day, 365 since 2014, but it happened now, and I would say that's a part of a bigger puzzle of rising controversy and the idea that problems with Russia on the sea could be almost the same as with China, and that Black Sea, South China Sea, Baltic Sea, they're all big parts of the puzzle is very important to consider altogether. As for the recent incident, I would say that sides try to to find new rules, new borders, new limits of new red lines, and the real problem here is that this style of questions and the style of approaches is mostly like from the 18th century, but the opportunities for navigation, for monitoring, when you can see every millimeter of territorial waters under the microscope, they are from the 21st century. And without some clear shared rules here, it would be very difficult to find some institutional solution. And in this situation, countries have to rely only on power solutions. And that kind of examples and tests we will see much often in the coming time, not only in the Black Sea, but also in other seas and oceans.
So Pavel, what happens next then, right? Because we also have now, as you well know, and looking at this now holistically as Europe as a whole, not just UK, Russia, but you know that the European Union today made a decision to not then have that meeting with Putin, even though France and Germany wanted that to occur. Is this a sign that things are about to get worse between these two sides? Because, you know, there was always, I think, at least on the Americans' part, and my understanding as well, was that the Europeans always tried to make it work with Russia because they're so much closer to Russia than America is. Is that changing?
The European Union is the main trade partner for Russia. And Russia is a significant supplier of energy sources to Europe. So that's why Europeans always try to be more moderate towards Russia, as well they were towards the Soviet Union several decades ago. But currently, the issue is not only this accident in the Black Sea, but also the court hearings in Gaga towards MH17, also the violations of chemical weapons prohibition made by Russia. So many other things. But besides that I mentioned about demonstration of power, I also should mention one very important thing. Currently, Russia doesn't have an internationally recognized borders because of Crimea. And Russia wants to force Europeans and Americans and NATO, the whole NATO, wants to force them to respect these borders, not to recognize, but at least to respect. So it's a tricky game, tricky political game. And Europeans understand this game very well, as I can see. And Europeans don't want to give Kremlin a lot of things, a lot of easings, and so on and so on.
Anastasia, what are your thoughts about that issue of territorial waters and, you know, the borders being exactly demarcated and marked out? That is an issue, right? And do you think that the Russians and the Europeans will be able to then agree upon what Russia's actual borders are, even in waters?
This is a question, definitely. This is not a unique question because we know many great powers that have serious and profound territorial disputes even among themselves, not among themselves and third parties, and it could work and remain more or less stably acknowledged as a problem for decades. Here, I think it's very important that this incident appear right now, and the coming reaction that, despite of the idea of Germany and France to launch some new kind of dialogue, one common solution was a task to European institutions to elaborate new sanction solutions, is very logical. We usually could forget that the whole package of anti-Russian sanctions initiated by European Union since 2014 wasn't just the follow-up to American sanctions. For European Union at that time, anti-Russian consensus was the one consensus point in all common European foreign and defense policy, because all other destinations, Mediterranean Sea, migration crisis, relations with states, relations with China, became more dividing lines, not speaking about Brexit and the separatism issues. And this consensus can be forgotten. And of course, some kind of meeting with Vladimir Putin now could be considered as a step towards an abolition of some sanctions in the coming future. Not now, not tomorrow, and not even after tomorrow, of course. It can't happen if any other consensus for coming European foreign defense policy would be on table. Climate doesn't work like this. It's more intra-European issue and European flag towards the others. It's not the policy as a part of foreign policy tool that is uniting the whole Europe now. Coronavirus and pandemic didn't happen this common ground for EU representation in the world. So it would be very too optimistic and over-optimistic to expect that some ideas of Germany or France, or even Germany, France, and Italy could really shift this point now. And the incident is not the reason why this suggestion failed.
Pavel, obviously, I mean, something like this, an incident like this can always go very, very wrong, right? But I would think that obviously both sides, including I'm talking about NATO right now, would not want to see proper, violence or violent escalation of any sort between the two sides. Is this then a question of both sides needing then to cooperate more and to coordinate more around what areas are sensitive for them? Do you think that the British too now will be more careful?
So we'll see, because such an accidents, they have one significant threat. It is an unintentional escalation. So let's imagine when the aircraft that tries to fly over the deck of the vessel may hit this vessel unintentionally because of technical reasons. The same is with Russian naval forces. So ship may hit another ship unintentionally because of technical reasons, because of technical accidents. And this escalation may appear unexpectedly. And that's why each side during the such confrontation, each side should avoid the behavior that may provoke the accidents. And for instance, the Russian side, in my opinion, as a Russian citizen, should be less provocative towards NATO vessels, towards Ukrainian vessels, and so on.
Okay, Anastasia, final word. We just have about a minute left. So Russia needs to be less provocative, or does the other side need to be less provocative? What are your thoughts on that?
My thought is that the advice to be less provocative is very good by its stimulus, but we will see more of the episodes of that kind. Countries would test more, would organize test drives of this new power politics on the sea, and the very important role of the expertise and of diplomacy now is to stimulate new deconflicting mechanisms and to shift it much more in an information playground agenda than on the real seashore confrontation. I absolutely agree that whenever you have two different missiles nearby, the risk of uncontrolled escalation exists. And the point now is to make it as manageable as possible, because the number of these incidents will increase, and partially because NATO officially declared that Russia and China are now adversaries, and the idea to implement similar policies would take place more and often exactly on the sea.
Very well. Well, we really appreciate both Anastasia and Pavel for taking their time out to share their expert insight with us. We were discussing there the incident that's occurred in the Black Sea, as we know, accusations back and forth between the British and the Russians about what exactly occurred, who fired on whom, who entered whose territorial waters, what exactly occurred. Nevertheless, it continues to show, regardless of who you believe, the tensions between the two sides. On the outside in, it does look like both sides are testing each other in some ways to see how much they can push each other and what each other's sensitivities may be in the Black Sea as well as in other regions. Russia's always complained about NATO expansionism, so this is an extension of that too, possibly. And we'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that, especially after today's decision by the European Union vis-a-vis not meeting Vladimir Putin. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss Russia once again from another angle. As we know, of course, Russia and the West disagree a lot on Syria as one of the many foreign policy issues that they do disagree on. And there's pressure right now by the United States and its allies on Russia to ensure that the Bab al-Hawa crossing, that is a crossing between Turkey and Syria, remains open towards Syria, of course, for humanitarian aid as a humanitarian corridor. The Russians are saying, or at least at this point in time, they have said that they would veto a UN resolution requiring that crossing to remain open, and that has raised concerns both of the United Nations and beyond that of what then that means for humanitarian aid that is badly needed by many, many Syrians on all sides of that conflict. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Michael Kimmage, who is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America. From 2014 to 2016, he was also policy planning staff member at U.S. State Department in the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He is joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us today from Moscow is Dr. Daria Vorobyeva, who is a research fellow at the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. Daria and Michael, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Daria, let me start with you. I'm trying to understand the Russian logic here, and maybe you can explain it to us. Why would Russia have a problem with the UN resolution requiring that Bab al-Hawa remain open?
Well, the officials say is that Russia is not sure that terrorist assistance to terrorist groups is not going through that corridor as well. But I think it's a much more complicated issue. On the one hand, Russians are not monsters, so they understand that millions of people are in their need of humanitarian help, and this corridor really helps a lot of people, including with COVID vaccines. On the other hand, I think Moscow is not really satisfied with the overall environment in regard to Syria. So maybe there are some trade-offs, including, okay, we don't mind this corridor to be open, but then we need to discuss lifting some sanctions on Damascus and on Syria, or maybe there should be increased humanitarian help from the West through Damascus route as well, through the government forces. And also there are some tensions between Turkey and Russia in regard to both Turkish influence in Caucasus and Ukraine, and even though it seems to be not directly related, it is related to Russian decision after all. So in short, I think we have to look at the broader position of Russia in Syria and in Turkey.
Daria there brought up a really good point. Is it wrong for us to just concentrate on the one issue of Bab al-Hawa instead of, in fact, maybe the bigger issue of sanctions on Damascus overall, which probably make it a lot harder for humanitarian aid to get in the sense that I would think it would be a lot easier to hand it to the government and say, listen, you distribute it, and or to work with the government on distributing such aid through the United Nations and in cooperation with the government, as well as that in other areas. So if you have other areas which are not under the control of the government, to have this be done in a lot more direct a fashion than necessarily towards or via Turkey and or any other intermediaries?
Well, precisely. I think the U.S. argument, which corresponds pretty closely, I would say, to the facts of the situation, is that if you get the closure of this humanitarian route, what you have to rely on really is the Assad government to manage all provision of humanitarian aid, and so far that's been enormously corrupt and inefficient. So there's that as one element of this issue. But on the other side, to sort of expand upon the point that Daria just made a moment ago, I think Russia sees this as a way to legitimate the Assad government, which has been a very long argument between the United States and Russia. And I don't think that the United States really has an alternative policy, but it's uncomfortable with this idea of Assad being legitimated in this fashion. So unfortunately, you have a humanitarian crisis, but you have quite a bit of politics and geopolitics that's swirling above it and to some degree getting in the way of helping people on the ground.
So, Daria, what do you think happens next then? I mean, do you think the Russians will be able to actually convince the rest of the international community, especially at the United Nations, to then legitimate, as Michael there said, Assad? I mean, will that really genuinely occur? I mean, we already know that many, or some countries, I should say, that had walked away from Assad are in fact slowly coming back to recognizing him, especially in the Arab world.
Well, I think it will be a really tough and long discussion, and Russia is really interested in making this work because, as my colleague mentioned, Damascus does suffer from large-scale corruption, and if this corridor is closed, then in certain parts of Syria, in certain refugee camps, there will be almost humanitarian catastrophe, and this will increase pressure on Damascus, on Moscow, and general negative outlook of Russia and the Syrian regime, and a little bit of Iran as well. So Russia doesn't want it. It would be much better to reach certain compromise when the corridor stays open and when certain interests of Russia and the Syrian government are met.
Michael, certainly the Western grievances with Assad's government are quite clear, but do you think that Moscow may be right in this case, that maybe it's time to change tactic in the sense that, the way that Russia's worked, obviously Russia's worked on the side of Assad, but maybe not to that extent, but maybe it is time to come around the table with Assad directly and to deal with him in a more direct fashion for the better of the Syrian people?
That may be true in theory, but I think from a Western point of view, there's really not any kind of credible diplomatic process at work that would make that outcome easy to accept. Daria mentioned a moment ago the presence of Iran in Syria, which is extensive, and that's a considerable problem for the U.S. And I think that from a Western point of view, there's just no real political future under Assad, so it remains extremely difficult to accept. But on the other hand, NATO, the United States, the West has not involved itself all that extensively in Syria and has very little leverage. So, at a certain point, it is, I think, fair to say that unless there's an alternative that you can present, this becomes a status quo, Assad in power, that will eventually have to be accepted. But, we can discuss that academically. I think the U.S. government is very far from drawing that conclusion at the moment.
Daria, for a while now, especially since actually Russia got involved on the side of Assad in Syria, we've seen more and more over the years, ever since, that Russia's outreach to the Middle East, and I'm talking more in macro terms now, has grown, right? And this is as we can arguably say that the U.S. role is ever so slowly diminishing in the region. Is this all part of that, in the sense that Russia is also sending out the signal that, listen, we are more in tune with what's happening in the Middle East?
Yes, I think Russia is trying to keep increasing its influence in the Middle East through Syria specifically right now, but through other countries as well. And I think, again, as was mentioned by Michael, that certain Western countries were not very keen to cooperate with Assad, and many are still not. And Russia could again increase its influence by saying, okay, you don't really trust the government, but we can take care of, let's say, humanitarian aid from the West coming to Syria. We guarantee that we will take care that not much corruption will take place, or that some certain investments will be made into Syria with some Russian assistance and etc. So yes, definitely Russia tries to keep its influence and increase its influence in the Middle East, and possibly to cooperate with the United States and the West on the terms it likes.
Michael, in a world where Russia has outreach programs to many Middle Eastern countries, and where it may very well try to fill the vacuum if there is one that's left with the U.S., concentrating on other parts of the world, how would that sit? In fact, let me put it this way: with Western countries, I mean, would they be okay giving up that role of theirs, so to speak, to Russia?
Well, I think that Russia plays a prominent role in a few Middle Eastern countries, certainly in Syria, Libya, and its developing relations with Egypt, and has a longstanding relationship with Iran. But I think still, if you take a big picture view, the U.S. presence in the region is considerably greater. I think that for Western powers, although they haven't liked it, exactly as Daria says, there's been a grudging acceptance of Russia's role in the region. There's not too much that they can really do about it. I think the open question is to what degree Russia can provide order and stability, and that really is a very open question in Syria. They've shown that they can exert influence, but they've been very far from resolving any of the regional conflicts. So that's, I think, what would really substantiate Russia's role in the Middle East, and they're, I think, quite far from reaching that. So you have a complicated situation in which China, Russia, and the West are all external powers and all operating in the Middle East, and there's a kind of uncomfortable negotiation that's going on in slow motion as to what the relationship of those three outside powers is going to be in this sort of complicated and sadly conflict-prone part of the world.
Daria, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Can the Russians, or do you think even, in fact, let me put it this way, do you think the Russians are looking to essentially hold the reins in the Middle East? Or do you think that if they were to, for example, have an upper hand, that they would in fact give a lot freer a hand to respective countries? Because as you well know, Daria, the criticism of American role in the region has been that America has tried to, in many ways, dictate what the region does.
Yeah, I think Russia wants to have a strong influence in the Middle East, including Syria, but it is not, Russia understands it's not strong enough to be the only one there. On the one hand, also China is trying to increase its influence in the area, and here Russia needs cooperation with Lebanon, with Iran, with the West to limit Chinese influence, because it doesn't want the country China to become to have too much influence. And at the same time, we should remember that Russia would like continuation of Assad or any other pro-Russian, or we could say sympathizing Russia regime in Syria. And for this, reconciliation and reconstruction of Syria is required, and Russia cannot provide it on its own, as well as Syria. So Russia is really interested in cooperation with the West in that regard as well, but on terms and conditions which are acceptable for the country.
All right, leave there at that, but we really appreciate both Daria and Michael for taking their time out of the no doubt busy schedules to speak to us today. Michael was speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and Daria was speaking to us today from Moscow. We were discussing there essentially the Russian role in the Middle East, but in this specific instance, we were talking about that humanitarian corridor that exists between Turkey and Syria called Bab al-Hawa, and the Russians saying that they are against a UN resolution demanding that remain open for various reasons, for reasons of terrorism, etc., that the Russians have expressed. There's a lot more going on here, as both of our guests there mentioned and contextualized for us. So it's a lot more than just humanitarian aid. It's a lot more than just this one humanitarian corridor. There's a lot more geopolitics, a lot more wrangling that is happening behind the scenes for various other reasons beyond just humanitarian aid. Will the West at some point in time learn to live with President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, as the Russians would want them to, for Russia's own national interest reasons as well? Those are all very open-ended questions at this point in time. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.